Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. We're going to take a couple minutes to just let all the attendees come on in. Uh, Today, we're going to be hearing from Tom Ulanowski and Dave Fox discussing the environmental impacts of cannabis production. Like I say, we're going to give the audience about 5 minutes to gather before Tom starts speaking. So in the meantime, I'm just going to fill time with my talking. For those unfamiliar with StratCan, stratcan.com is a cannabis industry publication based in British Columbia, covering the Canadian cannabis industry with a special focus on the micro cannabis license category and new license holders since legalization. We today are going to be discussing, as I said, the environmental impacts of cannabis production. One of the issues that has sort of spurred this conversation was a recent paper published in Nature. I will be sharing a screen there in a moment. You'll be able to see the greenhouse gas emissions of indoor cannabis production in the United States has really sort of restoked an ongoing conversation in the industry on the environmental impact and the carbon footprint of cannabis production, especially indoor cannabis production. And while this paper focused on the United States, obviously these issues are very relevant to Canada as well. So we'll hear a 45-minute talk or so first from Tom Ulanowski, and then there'll be a short break, and then another talk from Dave Fox. There will also be about 20-30 minutes of Q&A time at the end of both of those talks. But during the conversation, feel free to chime in the chat and the Q&A, and I believe Tom and Dave are both open to answering your questions kind of throughout the talk. So feel free to jump in there, and I will be poking them with any interesting questions that pop up throughout the conversation. So we're at 12:03 now. I think we'll give Tom maybe another 2 minutes to go grab his coffee, and then I'll pass it over to Tom. And in the meantime, you guys can check out some of the articles on StratCan and the various content that we've been covering over the last year and sort of the evolution of the Canadian cannabis industry. Okay, and Tom, if you're ready, I think we'll go ahead and pass things over to you. I'm ready to hear all of your amazing insight on this issue.
Hey, Dave, let's manage everyone's expectations, shall we? Greetings, everyone. Thank you for joining us on this lovely Sunday. I know that there's people all over Canada, the US, and even Europe joining us. So very exciting. So I'll just share my screen here. Give me 1 second, and then we'll get started. Okay, I hope everyone can see the full screen presentation there. Just bring up the chat window as well. Okay, great. So unless there are any issues, we'll proceed here. So yeah, it's an honor to be speaking with all of you this afternoon. This is a topic that is near and dear to my heart, a topic that has come up recently, like David said, with some recent publications, and actually a topic I've been talking about for about 2 years at various conferences and professional events in BC and around Canada. I just did a recent talk similar to this to the BC Institute of Agrologists, and there was enough demand to do another one open to the public. So here we are. So first and foremost, thanks StratCan and Dave Brown. I've known Dave for going on 6-7 years now. Back when the industry was very tiny. I still remember our first podcast interview Dave did with me while he was at another media company. And I really like what Dave's done here at StratCan. He's always been interested in pursuing the facts and the truth. And so that's what we're going to do today. So there is a lot of information to discuss today. It's very dense. That's on purpose. we are recording this webinar. We're going to release it publicly on YouTube or some other platform, and we're also going to share the PDF of this presentation. So, you can just sit back and relax and enjoy the data. And if you want to go back and reference more, that's why we have so much information in here. So the first part will be my part discussing the environmental impacts of cannabis production and the impact of our industry. We're going to delve into the Canadian legal industry and a little bit about its evolution for context. We're going to talk about what it takes to grow cannabis, and then focus on 3 peer-reviewed papers related to the carbon impacts primarily of our industry. And then we'll take a quick break. And then my friend and colleague Dave Fox will continue on the presentation, giving his insight, working with clients in the food and beverage industry in Canada, looking at how to make their businesses more efficient with the hope that we can take some of those ideas and implement them into our industry. And at the end, there's a Q&A. So you guys have a chat box. So throughout the whole program, feel free to chat. If there's anything to clarify during the actual chat or the talk, I will, I'll address that on the fly, but there's also a Q&A section there, a Q&A chat box where you can submit questions to us and we can get them at the end. So without further ado, we'll begin. So a bit about me, why I'm talking to you here. I've been in this industry, in the legal cannabis industry, primarily here in BC for about 7 years. I'm currently with Nextleaf Labs. I serve as the VP of Quality Assurance and Regulatory Affairs, and my more formal titles under Health Canada are Quality Assurance Person and Responsible Person. So with Nextleaf, we run one of the largest automated cannabis extraction plants in North America, and we have manufacturing R&D infrastructure as well. Prior to my involvement with Nextleaf, I was the QAP and various other titles at Canna Farms, BC's first LP located in Hope. Very proud of the work that I've done there in the company and where it kind of came from and where it's gone. Over my 3 years there, I've released hundreds of batches of cannabis, over multiple tons, 200,000 plants tracked. We were the first licensed company to sell concentrate even before those were legal to sell. We were also one of the first to sell oil and live plants in Canada, and we did it all without pesticides using biocontrol. So again, very proud of my work there, and that's kind of what got me thinking about this topic. I've also taught for a number of years at Kwantlen Polytechnic University on their cannabis production and facility management course. But prior to my work with all of this, I was an environmental researcher and scientist doing graduate work at the University of Western Ontario. And in fact, my life before cannabis was centered around water, carbon, and biogeochemical cycling in Canada's subarctic. So here's some pictures with my good buddy Dave here, while we are stuck in the middle of nowhere, looking at how these ecosystems function and how they change when they're disturbed by large-scale mining. So, this presentation takes kind of my previous life in environmental science and now my current life with cannabis, and give some context there. So we're here to talk about weed, of course, but we're going to elevate the conversation as always. We're going to talk about cannabis. So there are many different types of cannabis, sativa, indica, taxonomical classifications. We're not going to worry about that. It's all cannabis for this discussion. I'm going to mention things like hemp, and there's often confusion there. And hemp is cannabis. It's just operationally defined as having less than 0.3% total THC, and that is a Canadian definition that is essentially accepted throughout the world. And I'm also going to talk about medical cannabis at times. There is no difference really, other than we focus on quality, safety, and standardization when it comes to cannabis. But in Canada, all cannabis is produced under one system, and there's just different distribution channels of the same cannabis. So really, there's no difference in Canada at this point, other than who is buying it and how they're buying it. So we're talking about cannabis because Canadians love cannabis. And so here's this an image I got from Wikipedia showing that Canadians have the highest consumption rate of cannabis in the world. So on average, 2 to 4% of the people in the world consume cannabis per year. In Canada, it's about 1/3. And throughout this program, actually, I'll be doing a little bit of interacting with all of you. So whenever you see a black box with a red question mark, I want you to type into the chat box if you want what you think the answer to that question is. So this is just a a way for you guys to kind of stay awake throughout the presentation. So can anyone tell me what they think the annual Canadian demand for cannabis is in kilos? Give you guys a few seconds. 2 million kilos. Okay, well, it's actually thanks, Adam. Kilos, not funded capacity. It is about 1 million kilos. Okay, give or take. So that's what we're dealing with in Canada. So that right away gives you an idea of how big this industry is. So we're also probably not surprised that because of our love of cannabis, we are one of the first countries, the first G20 country in the world to legalize adult use or recreational or non-medical cannabis. This happened in October in 2018. And since then, the industry has evolved a little bit. um uh, but it's got deeper roots, which we'll talk about in a second. So a lot of people ask, why did Canada legalize cannabis? A number of reasons. This is all from the liberal platform, the government platform. We wanted to protect the youth, of course, from restricting their access and being induced to use cannabis. We wanted to deter illegal activities in relation to cannabis by enforcing it and provide for a legal production pathway. We obviously want to reduce the burden on the criminal justice system, provide access to a quality controlled supply. So there's my job security for the foreseeable future, and enhance public awareness of potential health risk associated with cannabis. So it's clear that prohibition does not work, but you'll also notice that none of these really address environmental concerns. And we're going to touch on that throughout the presentation. So to give you an idea of how big this recently nascent industry is, here's some data direct from Stats Canada for the last 11 years, since 2010, showing our industry's contribution to Canada's GDP. So the black line is the total, the green line is legal. You can see that in 2018, that's when it really started taking off, because that's when cannabis was legalized. Prior to that, we had a few years of medical sales, and then the illicit line is in red. So what's clear from this is that our contribution to our economy is growing every year. The illicit market is going down slowly, but we still have quite a long way to go. What's surprising to me even to learn is that the Canadian legal cannabis industry contributes more to our country's GDP than mining, so iron mining, gold mining, potash, copper, breweries, meat manufacturing, clothing, forestry, and it's nearly equivalent to defense and legal services. So it's not a small industry, it's just new. And so that's also something to keep in mind. So a very brief introduction for those of you unfamiliar with the history of cannabis in Canada. For the most part, legal cannabis in Canada and the laws surrounding that have been driven by court challenges or charter challenges, and they've been reactive to those. So it's not until recently that the government wanted to legalize this. It was kind of their hand was forced over the last 20 something years. So we started with the MMAR program. It was our first legal personal production system. So no commercial producers other than one. And essentially you would go to your doctor would recommend or authorize you to grow cannabis for yourself or for someone else's behalf for medical purposes, and then you would just do that at home based on what the doctor thought you needed. So this system ended up issuing about 40,000 personal licenses, more than half in BC. And at some point, the conservative government said, you know what, we've lost control here. There's no way for us to really know what's going on. There's some people taking advantage of this system and diverting cannabis to the illicit market. So they basically took that system away, and we ended up with the MMPR program, which allowed private companies to obtain a license from Health Canada to produce and sell cannabis directly to patients. So it replaced the MMAR, removed personal production. That was not taken too lightly by people who were relying on personal production for financial reasons or genetic reasons to grow their own. So another court case led to the ACMPR. where we brought back personal production, left the commercial licensed production system, and we also added cannabis oils to the market. And then finally, the newest system is essentially an evolution of that. It's the cannabis regulations, again, October 17, 2018, basically extended that medical program to have any adult in Canada to be able to access cannabis. And now we have homegrown for most Canadians, unless you live in a few select provinces. A year after that, we launched edibles and concentrates and other non-dried flower cannabis derivative products. And outdoor cannabis is also allowed to be grown and produced, as well as the hemp production is allowed. So a much more comprehensive system than what we started with, and very unique when it comes to the global cannabis industry. So here's a overview of where we are as an industry in Canada. I love doing this slide because I essentially have to update it every time I do a presentation like this. So on the left, we have the map of Canada showing the number of license holders per province. You can see here in BC, we have a quarter of the 600 some odd licenses. This is relatively new data from a few weeks ago. The top right graph shows the annual growth of licenses, which follows an exponential curve. That red star is where I entered the industry. So there's about 15 or 20 licensed producers, and now we have about 600. And the license or the chart on the bottom right shows the different licenses you can have, because we now have different license classes and subclasses that allow companies to specialize rather than be forced to be vertically integrated. So this is a much more mature market, but we still have a long way to go. The question is, when are we going to run out of licenses? If we keep this pace up the next 2 years, we'll have 2,000 licenses. I doubt that the industry will be able to sustain that. So what does the supply in Canada look like? It's a bit concerning. So you remember that our annual total demand is around 1 million kilos. And if you look at vaults across Canada, which Health Canada keeps great records of, because every month companies like my own have to provide very detailed report to the government of what we have on hand, what we destroyed, that kind of data. So as of November 2020, we are exceeding 1 million kilos in vaults, but we've yet to capture all of the market in Canada. So this is very likely unusable, unsellable cannabis that will likely go to waste. And that's quite unfortunate. The problem is getting better. This is data from the Canalists. I check them out if you want. They do some great analysis of the industry. This is showing recreational cannabis sales by month. You can see that there's a steady increase month over month. We're now at about a three point something billion dollar annual industry. So that's great news, but we still have a long way to go. When you look at how much the industry has captured of the illicit market, this is data from Statistics Canada, from Marijuana Business Daily. That top line there is the legal market. For every quarter, that darker purple line is the legal market, and then the orange line at the bottom is the legal medical market. So what's very interesting to me in about Q2, Q3 2020 is we've hit an inflection point in Canada where basically we have the legal industry has captured the majority of the cannabis expenditure or sales in Canada. So that's great news. We're only talking about 2 or 3 years after legalization for adult use, and we've already got to that point. So still a long way to go, but we're making progress. And one of the major reasons why we're making that progress is the cost of the flower has really come down over the years. So again, the blue line is this is data from the Ontario Cannabis Store, which just released a report for the year showing the different sales, again, broken down by quarter. You can see that the blue line is the private retail stores and the average cost per gram. The green one is the direct cost from Ontario Cannabis Store, and the gray one is the estimated illicit market. So again, we've hit an inflection point here where it's cheaper to buy legal, quality controlled cannabis directly from the government than the illicit market on average. Of course, there's a huge distribution there, but when price is a major factor for consumers, this is why we're seeing progress. The downside of this is that we have many more players in the supply chain, and the prices are going down. So it's ever more increasingly more difficult to run a sustainable business, economically speaking. And this is why we have to look at sustainability as well from an environmental aspect, because they're very tightly uh, controlled. So we're going to talk about cultivation now, because it's very important for us to be able to understand what it takes to grow cannabis in order for us to look at the impacts it's having. So cannabis is a wonderful plant. It exhibits extreme genetic and morphological diversity. These are pictures that I took while employed growing cannabis. On the left, we have a tiny little plant that's this beautiful purple color, and it's 15, 20% THC, is done in 7 weeks. On the right, we have a high CBD cultivar, almost looks like hemp, similar to Charlotte's Web, over 20% CBD, takes about 12 weeks to mature, and then you have everything in between. So, take this into consideration when we're looking at the data and the models. When we're looking at averages, of course, there's going to be a big spread in these estimates here, but ultimately, it's all cannabis, and we're all going to kind of treat it the same for the purpose of this discussion. So, to grow cannabis, we only focus on female plants that produce flowers or buds. So most cannabis cultivation facilities are just focused on producing flower and female versions of those flowers. Cannabis is light loving, and the photoperiod dictates life cycle. So depending on how much light it receives, 18 hours or 24 versus 12, it's going to have a different maturity stage. So generally speaking, it takes 3 to 5 months to grow a crop, depending on how you're doing it in the genetics, but about 2 or 3 weeks to clone or propagate something from seed. You continue that vegetative growth with medium intensity lighting for about 18 hours a day over a month or two, and then you flip that into flower. You lower the photo period to 12 hours, and you continue that daily for 7 to 12 weeks on average, and you end up with something like a picture on the right, a cannabis plant covered in trichomes, which contain all these active ingredients. So you have a lot of light. You have to control that climate because you're inputting a lot of energy, and so you have to maintain good airflow and climate control. And the rest is just like growing any other plant. You need a grow medium, something that's high porosity and well draining. Peat or cocoa core and perlite are generally what you find. Rock wool as well, clay pebbles, and even soil and living soil. And nutrients, I mean, cannabis plants are plants after all. They're, similar to the tomatoes, if you will, as to their needs for NPK, but they do grow quickly and they do put on a lot of mass. So the amount of nutrients you require, or the concentration you need to feed, is a lot different than most other plants. So here's some pictures of the various ways that cannabis can be produced. On the left, I believe this is a local picture from Tantalus Labs. It's a greenhouse when they didn't have any artificial lighting. On the right is a picture I took of an indoor or bunker style facility where all the light and everything is fed artificially. Here is an example of a hybrid greenhouse, which is, a high-tech greenhouse, which has things like blackout curtains, and it utilizes the power of the sun whenever that's possible, but it also has lighting in there to supplement during different days or changes in seasons. Outdoor cannabis, what a concept, right? Growing plants outdoors. It is possible. And this is possible now legally in the commercial market since 2018. The downside is we live in Canada, not the most tropical country in the world, and we can't really control light or climate. So it is farming. It's essentially farming, and all the risks and rewards that come with farming are the same for cannabis as they are for any other crop. But microclimate is important, as well as climate. And let's not forget hemp. It's been legal in Canada since 1998. It's gotten a lot easier to get your hemp license and grow. And again, since about 2018, hemp farmers can sell their hemp biomass to a processor like Nextleaf, where we can extract the active ingredients and then bring that into the cannabis market. So now Generally, typically any farmer that wants to grow hemp can do so without fences or high security, and then contribute to the cannabis economy. So ultimately, there's a lot of decisions that you have to consider when you're looking at growing indoors or outdoors. But at the end of the day, we're going to talk about indoor cannabis, which is expensive, but we have to consider laws, regulations, the goals, and energy costs and limitations. So that's what the focus of this rest of this presentation is on. So when we look at a typical grow operation or indoor cultivation facility, we have a number of different variables. We have the plants in there, we have the light, climate control, plant management and manicuring, atmosphere, that kind of stuff. So just like any other farming or any really process, manufacturing process, we want to maximize the output of cannabis or cannabinoids. Those are sometimes the same, sometimes different goals, while we minimize our inputs. And the major inputs are energy or light, water, nutrients, and CO2. The fundamental problem that we're going to get into right now is light or indoor cannabis cultivation is very energy intensive. So just to give you some high level ideas of what that requires, in an indoor bunker style facility, you have 1,000 watt high pressure sodium light positioned every 4 or 5 feet. You have about half a ton of air conditioning to pull out the energy that inefficient light is putting into your room. You have to irrigate about 10 liters a day per light. And if you do your job well, after that 3 or 4 month cycle, you should be pulling out on average a kilo or over 2 pounds of finished dried flower per light. And so, again, light is very important. I would argue the most important variable. Um, there are many considerations here and assumptions, but ultimately the more light you put in, the more yield you'll get out, right? And spectrum does matter. And so these are different examples, different light sources. We can have compact fluorescence, we can have high pressure sodium, and perhaps newest on the market are LEDs, which have finally caught up to the spectrum that is needed to grow cannabis efficiently. And of course, again, all that light is contributing energy into your environment. You have to pull that out. And so temperature and humidity can be controlled because it has to be controlled to basically optimize evapotranspiration rate, to limit pests or disease. So you need fans, you need air conditioning, you need dehumidification, and you need carbon filtration for odor. So generally, we're looking at room temperature, right? I mean, it varies. You kind of go colder and drier from seed to flower. But if you walk into a grow room and it feels too warm or humid, it probably is. Okay, so that's the kind of system we're working with. So now that you guys know what it takes to grow cannabis, we're going to delve into the environmental concerns related to indoor cannabis production. So a good colleague of mine used to start his presentations with these two fundamental questions, and I really like them because they kind of give a lot of context for the remaining slides. And the first part is, so what? Why do we care? So the reality is demand for legal cannabis continues to grow. We've seen that with the data presented. Legalization is a global phenomenon. So Canada is the first, but not the last country to go down this path. So I would argue we have a great opportunity to be a leader in this space. And we're a new industry, right? A lot of capital has been deployed to build world-class facilities, but there's still going to be ongoing construction projects. There's never been a better time to think about sustainability than when you're starting a project, right? Retrofitting and changing out your systems after the fact can be very disruptive. So now is the best time to think about this. The big issue in this industry is essentially no one's making money. The prices keep falling, competition is increasing. The government has applied a number of taxation programs so that it really jacks up the price and lowers the margins for most of the players in the industry. So environmental sustainability will also ensure long-term economic success for businesses large and small. And I hope I don't need to drive home the point that global climate change is a global problem. It's all of our problem, and we need to do everything we can to limit greenhouse gases. So who cares about environmental sustainability when it comes to cannabis? I would argue everyone should care. the business owners, the cultivators and processors to lower their impact and lower their costs, the consumers and the shareholders. Again, the cost of cannabis is reflected by what it takes to grow it, the accountants to make sure that this business can survive, energy suppliers. My neighbor works for BC Hydro, and we were chatting recently, and he was saying that most of his projects have been related to increasing working on substations for cannabis specific facilities. And BC Hydro has trouble keeping up with the demand, so they'd also want lower energy cost. So everyone should care about this. And the big thing to take away here is we have to harmonize cannabis or drug policy with environmental policy, because if we don't, then all of the progress that we have made thus far to mitigating climate change is at risk if we continue to ignore the carbon footprint of this industry. So when you ask people, when you ask consumers what they care about when purchasing cannabis, you get a number of different questions. So this is, again, from the OCS report, the most recent report. They ask new and returning customers what's most important to them when purchasing cannabis. And obviously quality, potency, and price are top three. That's just as expected. Of course, those are going to be an interest to consumers, but you can see environmental concerns or sustainable packaging. That's about 47 or 50% of people. So just to put it in another way, people care more about the picture of the product or how convenient it is to pay for their purchase than the environmental impact of the purchase they're making. So the question I have is, do consumers operate in an information environment that impedes these good purchase decisions? Is it that they don't care, or that they don't know that they should care, and there's no way to differentiate that? So something to keep in mind for producers looking to differentiate themselves. So we're gonna focus in on the energy primarily, or electricity related to environmental impacts, but there are many different impacts that we have to consider, and I'll mention those at the end, but really that's not the point of this conversation. So of course we have the input as energy, then we have air pollution, we have runoff as water and pesticides into water bodies and in our environment. So there's a lot going on here, but we will focus on the inputs. So this information here is from a paper published in 2020 by Evan Mills, one of the authors of the papers I'll be talking about for the next few slides. There's a lot going on here, but the point of this is to show you that producing, distributing, and selling cannabis requires a lot of energy, some direct, some indirect. So drivers of energy demand um, uh, include creating the inputs and energy used during production, processing, and downstream retail activities. Okay, so some of these have larger impacts more than others, and we'll see that on the next slide. But generally, this is a great paper. I highly recommend it. That reference at the bottom. It's a fantastic paper, and it's really in depth at what it takes to grow a kilo of cannabis. So we're going to play a little game here. So I hope you guys are still awake. So every single box there is going to be a question I ask. And if you want to just participate, feel free to just chime in on the group chat here. And then we'll go through this rather quickly. So the sad news is indoor cannabis cultivation is one of the most energy intensive industries in the world. The graphic on the right is from Evan Mills in 2012, a paper published in Energy Policy, and a paper that has been fundamental for me, changing my view of indoor cannabis production. Highly recommend that paper. This is a chart showing comparing cannabis to other industries, and it's alarming how much of an impact we have energy-wise to generate $1,000 worth of sales versus other industries like paper, chemical, metal. So really, really, really depressing statistics. So my first question to the audience here: what percentage of electricity does indoor cannabis consumption use in the U.S.? 0.02%, 1%, 5, 7. Perfect. Okay. Well, we're at about 1 to 2% based on this paper. So that's the equivalent of about 1.7 million homes or 7 average US power plants. Next question. This is a big one. Consider a kilo of dried cannabis. For those of you that have never seen a kilo of dried cannabis, that's a very loosely packed 5-gallon pail of nice buds, maybe a little less. 1 kilo of dried cannabis, how many kilos of CO2 equivalent emissions do we produce on average based on this paper? 1,200 kilos, 5. That's a very good point. We have someone saying that depends where it was grown. Of course, the energy can be produced much cleaner in some areas, but this is taking into account the average U.S. energy mix. 5 tons, ladies and gentlemen, 4,600 kilos of CO2 to produce 1 kilo of cannabis. So that's the equivalent of 5 trips across the US at 5.3 liters per 100 kilometers. So a nice, efficient Honda Civic, that's what 1 kilo of cannabis requires. So another way to think about this, if you spark up a joint, which some of you may have in your past, what's the equivalent distance you'd need to drive in an efficient car or to kind of equal that one joint or the embedded emissions in that joint? "50 kilometers." Almost right, 37 kilometers, okay? Or it's kind of like operating a 100-watt incandescent light bulb for 25 hours. So um, again, huge impact. For the millennials in the audience, how many grams of cannabis does it take to equate the energy required to have 1 Bitcoin transaction verified? And this is a slight both on cannabis and also Bitcoin. A disgusting amount. 100 grams. That's all it takes. So not only is cannabis inefficient, but also is Bitcoin. So the next time you procure your cannabis with Bitcoins, for every 100 grams you buy, you're basically doubling that energy. And then at the last one, so imagine you are someone who consumes 1 gram of cannabis per day every day. So that's an average amount. I know people that probably consume 10 times that amount, but let's just use a nice round number, 1 gram a day. So how many tons of CO2 do you contribute? Or another way to put it, what percentage of your per capita emissions do you contribute in Canada just by that 1 gram a day consumption? So just by smoking 1 gram a day or using 1 gram a day, it's 1.7 tons or 10% of your per capita emissions. So if you're an environmentally friendly person, but you have a cannabis consumption habit at 1 gram a day, you're probably contributing more than anyone else that's just not consuming cannabis. And so the issue is 50% of the wholesale price of cannabis is due is directly related to energy costs. So again, when we talk about economic drivers of sustainability, if we can lower energy costs for a cannabis, we can really lower the price and make sure we have a sustainable business. So this is another way to look at this balance again from this paper. Again, when we look at this balance, 80% of the energy balance is directly related to lighting, ventilation, and cooling. Okay. So it doesn't matter if you're growing organically, doesn't matter if you're buying locally, that has absolutely almost no impact to the total energy impact that indoor cannabis cultivation has. So, the best way to approach this problem is to limit energy use and do things like replace HPS lighting with LEDs or utilize the power of the sun. And if you can't do that, manage your energy very, very well. So again, this is from the 2012 paper. that I would hope everyone looks at. And so Dave Brown mentioned this Nature paper that just came out in March. So we'll switch our focus to this. This is essentially an extension of this Evan Mills paper that I was just going over. So what Evan Mills did is we kind of looked at a small modular grow compartment, like a few plants, and then did a mass balance for that. This Nature paper kind of took the next step and did a GIS model. Again, a lot of assumptions baked in, but they looked at energy consumption of cannabis on a nationwide scale using a GIS modeling approach. So what they found is very similar to what the other paper found. More than 80% of the greenhouse gas emissions for these locations are generated by practices that are non-traditional for agriculture, right? So you can see these graphs. They have their energy emissions are based on location as well. So some locations have cleaner energy than others. But that top little bar, that top 5-10%, is nutrients, plants, soil, water. That's a very small amount of the pie. The remaining 80% is HVAC, grow lights, CO2, that kind of stuff. So basically, the story is the same no matter how much you look at it. Indoor cannabis production is driven by energy, and the other factors are very small compared to lighting, heating, and ventilation, or cooling and ventilation. So what this study did from Nature, they analyzed the energy and materials required to grow cannabis indoors and quantified these cannabis emissions using a life cycle assessment methodology from cradle to gate. So everything, even what it takes to produce that nitrogen that you feed your plants, they took that into consideration all the way. So truly from seed to sale and even back. And the analysis was performed across the US, accounting for geographic variations in meteorological and electrical grid data. So what this shows is the hotter and more humid your outdoor climate is, generally you're going to use more energy because you're battling the energy and the climate on the inside, but also on the outside. But this is not the whole story. Like I said, different parts of the electrical grid have different emissions. Some are much cleaner. Maybe they have solar or hydro electricity, and some are maybe coal or natural gas. So when you layer on that variable, you'll notice that it's not the hotter or more humid parts of the U.S. that are contributing most to climate or to greenhouse gas emissions. It's the places that have the dirtiest energy mixture. So this study came to the same conclusion: between 2.2 and 5 tons of CO2 equivalent emissions baked into every kilo of dried flower, but it varies more than 6-fold depending on where you are. So if I was trying to optimize growing, I would grow in California. It's a nice temperate climate. The energy is very renewable. Why would I grow in the middle of the US here? The only reason I can't right now is because of law and politics. Right now, there's a federal restriction on carrying cannabis across state lines. So when we do some back of the napkin math as to what our impact here in Canada is, if we assume a demand of 100,000 kilos a year, we assume half is from indoor, half from greenhouse cultivation, which has half the emissions. Again, very high level math. We look at about half of our emissions in Canada directly contributed to cannabis, 6% of our agricultural emissions, or about half of all emissions generated by passenger flights. So again, outdoors not considered, a lot of assumptions baked in, but the numbers are pretty significant regardless. So how do we improve energy efficiency? Well, we can use hybrid greenhouse designs and use the free power of the sun, like Tantalus Labs here in BC or Aurora Sky in Edmonton. We can grow cannabis outdoors, especially for extraction grade cannabis. What I'd like to see is government programs like they have in the US that incentivizes cultivators or processors to make more energy efficient decisions, because the graph on the right shows that we can improve our emissions if we use technology and if we design the systems in a way so that they are optimized. We can do energy audits and upgrades, and that's something that my colleague Dave Fox will be talking about in a little while. We can extract anything that's low quality or unsellable. That's something we're going to mention here in a second. And generally competition. I think generally, the more competition we have, there will be a price drop, but it's going to force companies to be more efficient. And yes, I see you guys have the questions coming. Just please keep putting them in, and we'll address them at the end. So here's some data that I saw during a presentation at the Portland Cannabis Science Conference. This is data presented by Dr. Justice, looking at their company. So they had an indoor cultivation facility that they were using HPS lights, and then they wanted to do a cost analysis of what it would take for the capex to upgrade to LED lights, and then if they use different types of LED lights, what kind of savings that they can then get in the return on investment. So they compared two different LED lights versus a standard 1,000-watt HPS light, and what they found that there's a return on investment. Return on investment after the second harvest. And if you stack stack your lights in multiple tiers, which is possible with LEDs, you can actually increase your revenue 2.5 times per square foot, because the energy is more efficient. Their energy management is more efficient with LEDs. And again, this was I missed this slide, but basically showing that you can actually use LEDs to increase yield and decrease your energy use in certain cases. So depending on the wattage of your LED, you can go for the same energy use and increase yield, or if you go slightly lower LED wattage, you can increase your yield and decrease your cost. So it is possible to be more efficient. So that's it for energy. We're just going to do a few other things when it comes to environmental impacts, and then we'll have a quick break, and then Dave will continue. So water use in cannabis facilities, another major issue, no different than any manufacturing facility. Obviously, it's used for irrigation, also sanitation, manufacturing, cooling, and domestic use. So, water use in a cannabis facility is very high. And there's different factors affecting that. How you're growing, how productive your plants are, how fast they transpire, your climate, the cannabis you're growing, the seasonality, maturity. So a lot to consider here. But generally speaking, if we look at cannabis compared to other crops, we see that it's not much different than grapes or almonds or corn, right? So it's not the thirstiest crop, but it's still something that we should consider, especially when we're growing indoors, because there's opportunities for us to recapture water and make it more efficient where we can't do that outdoors. There's other environmental considerations. This was something that Metro Vancouver launched last year due to a number of odor issues in the area. They were concerned that the VOCs released by indoor cannabis cultivation facilities, when mixed with nitrogen dioxide and sunlight and heat, can cause ground level ozone. So this has been shown to be true in the scientific world. The question is, how big of an impact does this have on a larger scale in a larger region? So they actually have an ongoing study now, but you can see that their VOC emissions in comparison to other industries are fairly low, but much higher than all of the agriculture done in the area or comparable to fuel distribution. So their stance is that it's not insignificant, and since we police these other industries, we should police cannabis. But the data is quite scant, and so they went back to the drawing board, as far as I can tell, before they make any decisions. So I'll conclude this portion with there's other environmental concerns. Light pollution. The bottom picture on the bottom right is the blurple spectrum you see in Leamington or other heavily agricultural areas in Canada. So who wants to live in an area like that? It would be cool for a couple days, but not year round. There's packaging waste. Gone are the days that you get a bunch of grams in a Ziploc bag. Now you have inside packaging, outside packaging, child-proof requirements. So that complicates that. You have disposable batteries as well. So general waste management is an issue. And then you just have these direct impacts. So here's a picture from the news this year of a company or a greenhouse producer or former greenhouse cannabis producer in BC, where on its surface this looks like a very, very environmentally friendly building. It's a big greenhouse, large, million plus square feet. It caught on fire this year, so the direct impacts of this facility are great. And also keep in mind, this facility, I believe, was also running on diesel generators because they needed all that power to supplement all that lighting in there. Because after all, we're in BC and not the tropics, so you need to supplement that. So a lot to consider. But the good news is we have, we're moving ahead as a society. We've recognized that cannabis is a legitimate crop. There's obviously we're getting more information. So the good news is that research on cannabis is increasing every year. Over the last 20 years, we've essentially seen an exponential growth on research. And as more countries legalize and access to this plant and this industry is easier, we're going to see this keep going, and we're going to learn a lot more about the plant, and therefore a lot more about how we can optimize our growing and distribution, that kind of stuff. So my company Nextleaf has gone down this path, so to speak. Our whole system is designed to work with cultivators who have excess biomass that they can't sell on the open market because maybe it doesn't look great, smell great, maybe it has some microbiological contamination. So what we're done is basically taking those active ingredients and refining them for a highly pure substance, so that we can sell that to formulators and as an ingredient to other processors. So again, we've put a significant amount of resources into this, and so far it's working out well. We've also looked at waste management. So one of our managing engineers, Dr. Krupal Paul, has actually published a paper looking at using the biomass from hemp or hemp stalk and seeing if we can generate an ash to substitute for coal ash that's used in cement production. And obviously there's other opportunities like turning our waste into biochar and sequestering that carbon for longer terms, because we've captured that carbon and we've used all that energy to produce that biomass. Let's not put it back out into the environment as soon as possible. So I'll leave you with a few thoughts here, and then we're going to have a break. So the good news about legalization is that we can now understand the patterns of energy use where that was not the case during the time where it was illicit, right? So now is an opportunity to compel the industry to manage consumption and keep its consequences in check. Canada is a global leader. Other countries are only now beginning to legalize medical or adult use cannabis. So fundamentally, what needs to happen is drug policy has to be decoupled from environmental policy, and we need that to change. We need to bring the environmental policy together. There are many papers that suggest that the cannabis sector is decades behind the rest of the economy, and ultimately we have a massive opportunity here to shape this industry. So I'll leave you with these thoughts before we segue into Dave here. So this is again the paper from 2020, looking at, for example, is sustainability even possible? So they looked at cannabis production and potential production in California, which has a relatively high amount of renewable energy use. And they looked at the amount of energy required if all the cannabis facilities were built out in Coachella. And then they looked at California's wind energy in 2018. And what they found was there was not even enough energy generated by wind to sustain only the cannabis industry if it was built out all the way. Another a group, a posterity group, released a report in Canada on agriculture looking at cannabis as part of their study, and they basically suggest that found that greenhouses used only about 1/3 less energy than indoor facilities. So we have this vision of a greenhouse as being environmentally friendly, but it's only about 30% more friendly. And these greenhouses are anything but green. They still use more energy per unit foot area than virtually any other commercial building type. We rival data center energy density for some of these facilities. And so they actually looked at how efficient can we make a greenhouse, and they saw that there was only about a 20% technical potential in savings if you really optimize the whole process. So, the final question that I'll leave you with is from this paper, and I'll read this to you. It's quite interesting to think about. So, proficiency in accomplishing the unnecessary will not yield true sustainability. Myopic optimization of an activity that does not have to be conducted in the first place is not a legitimate response to the very real risk society faces from climate change. The ethical integrity of indoor cultivation is in question. So, the reality is this: drug policy will not change overnight. Canada is still one of the only countries that legalized. We have a long way to go. So I would tend to agree that growing plants indoors in Canada that require tropical-like, sunlight and environmental conditions is not in the future the best interest of our future. But it is an issue that we have to change today. So with that, I'll end my presentation, and then we'll take a few minute break, and then Dave will enlighten us on some of the things he's doing with other non-cannabis companies. Thanks, everyone.
Hey, Tom, are you able to answer any of the questions in the chat while we wait for Dave to hop on?
Yeah, I could do that. Yeah, so there's a little break, so if anyone wants to grab some water or take another kind of break, by all means, and I'll just scroll through these right now. There's a question, there's a perception that Canada's energy coming from hydroelectric energy has less impact than in the US because they rely on oil-produced electricity. So, yes, that's true. For example, here in BC, we produce a lot of hydroelectric electricity. So does Ontario and Quebec, because they're close to a lot of waterways. But hydroelectric energy production is not obviously free from any impacts, right? We are damming rivers, we are flooding previously unflooded land, and there have been studies that show that there's also releases of emissions, carbon emissions, when you do that. So it's probably better, but on the hierarchy of kind of most efficient or most energy friendly to least energy friendly, you're looking at nuclear energy is probably the best. Then you're looking at renewable energy, and then obviously natural gas, coal, what have you. But luckily, coal is on its way out. Hopefully, you can use geothermal energy as well, but again, that's very specific to the geography or location. So something that not everyone can use. Did the footprint of packaging, processing, and distribution get captured in these numbers? It did in the Nature paper. So that was all the way to distribution. They said that they did try to capture that, but again, a lot of variability in how things are packaged. So it's hard to nail that down. The key thing to remember is the vast majority of the energy balance is associated with the energy inputs and managing those energy inputs. So in other words, the rest of the energy impact is negligible, about 10 or 20%, because most of it is energy. Can you also discuss the carbon footprint of making extracts, especially using hydrocarbon solvents? I'm planning on doing another presentation, not publicly, but I probably will float that idea about extraction specifically. I don't know any good data. What I would say is, yeah, you're releasing butane, propane directly into the environment at some point, so that's a direct impact. But luckily, it's pretty small compared to cultivation, indoor cultivation. Okay, great. So I think that covers some of the questions here. So whenever Dave's ready to go, I'll hand that over to him. And then at the end, we can have a much broader discussion. And then, of course, we can actually activate microphones for attendees after the fact and chat. So there's Dave. I'll shut up now.
How you doing? Thanks so much, Tom. Dave Brown, do you want me to hold off a bit for people returning back from break, or you just give me the go ahead?
No, I think you can just dive right in, Dave.
Excellent. Thanks, Tom. Thanks, Dracan, for having me. Pretty excited to have this talk. Let me just share my screen, throw on the presentation. All right, we all set? You can see that? Excellent. All right. So, hi, my name's Dave Fox. I work for a company called EnviroStewards. We're based just north of Waterloo in Ontario. And yeah, Tom invited me to this talk today to give my perspective from the food and beverage industry. And the reason for that is it's an established industry that we're doing sustainable engineering with. And you'll see that the systems I talk about, the utilities I talk about, they're not applicable just to your home or just to a chicken processing plant, for example, but are directly related to cannabis production facilities as well. So the idea is to take the learnings from the food and beverage industry that is quite established, and we've been doing these engineering projects with over many years, and seeing what sort of parallels can be used in Canada's cannabis industry and those growing facilities. So, this is me. It's a bit of a catfish photo. It's about 5 years ago. I had a bit more hair at that time, so I'm going to stick with it. My own background, I met Tom when I was doing my undergraduate thesis up at the mine that he mentioned, and really got my roots established in the sustainability world and the kind of impacts that humans are having on the planet with all the activities that we do. From that, I moved to a multinational consulting company where I basically cleaned up oil spills all day, and I thought, I'd rather be on the prevention side, have a bit more of an impact. So I've now been with EnviroStewards for 5 years. I started off in their managing their water department, and have now moved into the food loss and yield to increase the yields for our clients. And yeah, before COVID and even now, I'm in a different food and beverage industry or facility every day of the week. So it's really interesting to see the wins that some companies have done and take elements of that and apply it to other ones, and basically just make Canada's food and beverage industry more efficient. So it really makes for a lot of variety and a lot of cool projects that have been implemented. On the weekend, I'm a very different person. I got a 9-month-old now. He's keeping me very busy and try to get outside as much as I can. So there's our team in EnviroStewards. We're about 15 people. We're over 20 years old now. And we really strive to get the best out of our clients, to get the best out of our employees, and to really drive home these opportunities and just make the whole system more efficient. In doing that, we've been, got quite a few awards over the years. Clean 50, I'm not sure if you've heard of, but I encourage you to look into it. They host an excellent conference every year, and different, all the UN sustainability goals, we're working with our clients to achieve those as well. Another major part of our company is the Safe Water Project. So that's kind of our charitable wing, where we work with people in South Sudan and Uganda. And the idea isn't handing out charity to, just hand out things. What we do is we host conferences, teaching schools with them and with us, with the ultimate goal of providing safe drinking water to people in those regions. So if you're interested in more of that, we do have a TED Talk on that, and we'd encourage you to look into that a little bit more. So our company specifically, we're an engineering consulting firm, and we started off as a wastewater company. So we go into food and beverage manufacturers, look at their wastewater streams, and find ways to increase the capacity of their wastewater treatment systems. And what we saw in the first 2 or 3 years is that a lot of these companies are just taking their product and washing it down into their wastewater system. And obviously there's a double problem there. One, it overloads your wastewater system, and two, you're throwing out product that should be going out into a package for consumption. So what we started to do is really climb that ladder and move into the facility, and we learned that there's a lot of other wasting that's occurring too. Excessive energy use, excessive water use, and more recently in the last 5 years, we've really sunk our teeth into the loss of edible food. So that's in the form of raw ingredient or final product. And what we do is we collect quantitative data on all those different areas and present solutions so that changes can be made and revenue can be realized and wastes are cut down. And we're pretty proud of ourselves. Our average ROI on all of our projects is under a year, which is significant when you're presenting these ideas to the finance and the C-suite of any company. This is I grabbed a handful of companies that we've worked with over the years. I kind of focused a little bit more on brewery with this specific slide because I know there is some parallels between brewery and cannabis. But basically, if you've eaten it, I've probably seen how it's made, including hot dogs, which is entertaining. And here's a quick snapshot of what we do with a company. So here's two breweries. They're local to me. I'm in Guelph. And so what we do is we find ways to reduce the amount of water they've used every year to produce their product, but also electricity and natural gas. You can see some significant droppings. And when you consider a lot of these companies, when you look at their utility bills, it's not uncommon to see, a gas bill for $1.2 million a year or a water bill for $2 million a year. And so when you're knocking off, double-digit percentages off those utility bills, you're having a pretty significant impact on their bottom line. So again, if you could just make this a little more interactive, if you could throw in the chat box, if you were to consider, your electrical bill, your natural gas bill, and your water bill, and you're trying to find efficiencies in each one of those, which ones do you think would have the highest rate of return? Or if you could only invest $1,000, what would you tackle your electrical savings or your natural gas savings? Which one do you think would reap the highest rewards? Okay, so I see a lot of electricity coming up. And I guess this is a little biased, I guess, or a little off now because we did talk quite a bit about electricity during the cannabis talk. So most likely in a facility like that. But when we look at food and beverage, and really, we've done quite a bit of work in pharmaceutical and auto as well. By far and away, it's water. And I think there's quite a few reasons as to why that is. I think as Canadians, we have a perception that water's free because it's everywhere. And then I think the other reason is just the way we manage water. We're very loose with it, unfortunately. So on the slide here, this is what we typically present to our clients. This is what we call our opportunity table. So this is a redacted table of a holistic report. So what we did was we went into this facility for about 2 months and we looked at absolutely everything. We metered minute by minute all their water use, all their electrical use, and all their thermal use. So on the far left column, there's all the opportunities that we would find. So, you can see a couple that were related to the boiler system, some related to their HVAC system, heating system, so on and so forth. And then those 3 columns to the right, that's their water, electrical, and natural gas use. So when you sum up the savings, you can see by far and away, water was where the biggest savings are going to be realized. Now, you may also see in the natural gas column that adds up to $253,000, which is more than the water column. But on line 3.1a, you can see that it's actually a water and natural gas column, or opportunity. So in this case, we were heating water and then wasting that water. So ultimately, it's still a water issue. So for that reason, for the top of this talk, there's going to be 3 parts. I wanted to focus on water because it's going to be your highest area of savings. So quite a few things with water and why it makes it so important. Every year we see that, people tell us about their water bills, and every year municipalities are constantly bumping them up 5-10%. So even if you use the exact same amount of water every year, your bill's still going to be going up. The other issue is, and like I've mentioned, you're going to get your highest rates of return on your water use if you implement savings just on that utility. And then from an ecological point of view, I heard this from one C-suite level person. He said, you know what, saving water is great on a financial terms. There's no debate there. But virgin groundwater should stay in the ground. We shouldn't be pumping it out of the ground and then spilling it all over the floor for no reason. And of course, there's your third most important reason why we should look at water. But I thought I'd add, great gift. So to kind of bring it all back to home and to put a more of a human touch on this, I wanted to bring water use into our households and consider it in our home and the cost in our home. And then what I'm going to do is expand that out on an industrial level, so you kind of get a more hands-on approach of what we're talking about here. So what we do in a lot of facilities, we use a lot of advanced equipment, but we also do what we call a bucket and stopwatch test. So basically turning on whatever the water user is, letting it pour into a bucket and timing that, and then we can understand what that flow rate is and multiply that out over their production schedules. So I'd encourage you to do this. I did this with a class of Humber College graduates the other day. Take a wine bottle or any vessel in your home and throw it under your tap in your kitchen sink, let it run, time it, and get an idea of what your water use is. And then if anyone wants to reply back with some photo evidence, I'd love to have a coffee with them, virtual coffee, of course, and we can talk shop and expand on more of the stuff we're talking about today, and it'd be great to meet you. So this is why I ask you to do it, because there is a big difference between a tap that flows at 8 liters a minute and one that flows at 13 liters a minute. So about a 5 minute per liter difference per minute. So if you're using your kitchen sink for things like what we call once through, so washing your hands, washing your dishes without filling the sink, thawing frozen meat, letting hot water flow over it, or just rinsing your sink and other things, you can see that it adds up quite quickly. So just in your home, if you were to reduce the water flow in your sink by just 5 liters a minute, that's about $216 a year in water savings, which is pretty significant. That's $3.95 a cubic meter. That's Toronto's water rate. So what does this mean, and how do you find this solution? Well, once you find out your kitchen flow rate, I just threw up an image here from the Guelph Home Depot. You can go there, get an aerator, throw it in your sink. It costs $7. You're going to save $216 in 1 year. There's a pretty significant rate on return. Tesla's been in the news quite a bit lately for having a great rate of return. Well, you're 30 times that, so, or I guess 4 times what Tesla would be. So once we take that idea of water, the value of it, and how you can find solutions to wasted water, I want to expand that onto an industrial level. So what we use is minute by minute ultrasonic flow meters. So we would put that on the main of a facility as well as all their independent water users. So we can meter minute by minute exactly what that system is using. We actually put it on our staff or office water line just for fun to test it out. And they're so detailed, we could actually see who was and who wasn't using the sink after they went to the washroom, which is kind of funny. So what we're going to do is we're going to put that ultrasonic meter on, and it produces that graph in the bottom right. And you're going to see the blue line is your instantaneous flow rate of liters per minute. And then that turquoise up into the right line, that's showing your overall consumption as it adds up throughout the day. So and then once we do that, we can then break down exactly what device is using that amount of water. So again, this is a redacted water balance that we have from a large facility. And you can show exactly line by line exactly what device is using that amount of water. And the really fascinating thing about this water balance is we bring it to a boardroom, with everyone there. So your production staff, your C-level suite, your VPs, and inevitably there's something on this table, and some people are like, wow, I didn't realize the tote wash was using that much amount of water. Let's really focus in on that, and so on and so forth. So it really gives an overview of what's going on. Because for a lot of us, water's in the pipe, you can't see it, you don't really think about it. So this is one of the more exciting parts of my job. We put these meters on, we let it run for 2 weeks, let's say, try to get a holiday in there. And then we download that data. So here we have daily flow consumption at a facility. It's over 2 days. You can see 0 to 2400 and the 0 to 2400 again. So 2 days. And what we can start doing is we sit down with the production staff and we start putting markers on what's going on. So we know that these spikes were water softener regen. So it's a quick demand of water to flush out your water softener. We can see there's a sanitation signature here. So from about 3 to 7 in the morning, the sanitation crew, which is a really hard job to do, they're crawling all over the machines and washing them down with power washers and using a lot of water. But what's interesting is this is a weekend. So you have a Friday on the left and a Saturday on the right. The Saturday, there's no production. But you do see this kind of phantom sanitation shift that's occurring at about the same time. So what that's telling us is that there's some machines that are set to do a sanitation shift and will consume water to do so. but there's no one there doing sanitation. So that right off the bat, we can see that that's an unnecessary water user. So if you take a bigger look at this graph, again, I want to throw it out to people listening today. Is there anything on this graph that you find, I'll say, a little alarming, that looks a little strange? So I have a question of your cost of flow meter per device. They range about $10,000 to $15,000 for one of these units. There's obviously cheaper versions, and you can just put inline meters, which I'll talk about later. But our units cost about that much. So any ideas out there as to what's strange about the profile of this graph? Yeah, there it is, base flow. I like it. So the base flow, as you can see, no matter what's happening in that plant, and especially on Saturday when everything is off and everyone's left, we're still having a flow rate of 50 liters per minute, every minute of every day. So we did that test on your kitchen sink. We're only talking 30 minutes a day. And that yielded a $250 savings over a year in a household kitchen sink over 5 liters. Imagine what 50 liters of a baseline flow is going to do to your water bill at the end of the year at a large factory. So the other thing we need to do, once we found that 50 liter a minute flow, we then had to look for it, because it's one thing to identify it, but to find a solution is another thing. So this typically takes a while. It's a bit of a treasure hunt. And in this case, we found it in this floor in the boiler room of the factory. So I hope that's playing on your end. So we open this up. And there it is, flowing through a pipe. The lighting gets a little better. So there it is there on the bottom right. So what we found was that it was excessive water being used to cool what they call boiler blowdown cooling water. So just to unpack it a little bit here, most plants and maybe a cannabis grower would have a boiler system running. A boiler needs to get flushed on a regimented schedule, let's say every 30 minutes. So you have to flush all that hot water out of your boiler so that stuff doesn't build up inside of it. And city bylaws say that you can't put any water down the drain that's over 40 or 50 degrees Celsius. So the way most plants cool that water is they have a city line that's open and flushes the water in with that boiler blowdown water simply to cool it. And that should be using about 2 to 5% of your water use all year. Overall, it's unnecessary. There's many other ways you can do it without using city water that you're paying for. But in this case, a ball valve was open. The solenoid valve was broken. These solenoid valves cost about $500, and it was flowing all the time. So it was making up 35% or a third of their water use in a given year, which is incredible. At that particular location, they're paying $4.35 for a cubic meter of water. So on the first week we were there, we found this baseline flow. We located where it was, and we suggested some ways to bring that down. And it's not entirely complicated. I did the calculation with my calculator in my hand in front of them. It's $115,000 a year in water, which is pretty intense. So there's a lot of different ways that you can solve this problem. I think the best way is you just put a heat exchanger on that boiler blowdown cooling discharge, because it's full of hot water. You can then use that heat to heat another system like your boiler makeup, and then you can discharge that water cold. So that's a little bit higher investment value, but it's immediate water savings. So that's looking at one system in particular. And the reason I want to bring this slide in is just to show how water can be used throughout a whole facility. And some of these devices may be in a cannabis growing facility. And you might be able to take some wins away from this talk immediately. So these are 3 very common devices that we see at basically any food and beverage facility. And typically what happens is they're looked at as 3 unique different machines with 3 unique water inputs and outputs from them. And that water is bought from the city in 3 different units. So you have a vacuum pump at the top there. It needs water to seal the pump and to cool it. You then have your drum screen in your wastewater room. So your wastewater flows through that, but then every once in a while you have to spray that drum screen with heated water to blast the items off the screen, to clean it. And then that last one is another example of a boiler blowdown cooling tank. So that's what a cooling tank looks like. And again, 3 different streams of water going in there. But what if we were to simply connect all those devices so that you're only buying 1 unit of water? And that's exactly what we do. So first of all, we show the amount it's using and the value of that water. And then we show that there's ways to connect it. So you buy your 1 unit of city water, you send it through your seal. So now it's done its sealing purpose, but you've actually upgraded the value of that water. You've put heat into it now, but not too much heat. So it still has cooling capacity. So now it's going to go into your boiler blowdown, and it's going to cool that blowdown. And then you can recover the water again. And now you've actually added more value into it and made it even hotter. So now it's the ideal water to use in a drum screen cleaning situation. So really the only way you get traction with these opportunities is if you find the exact amount of water use, you put a value to it, and you simply show the geography in the plant. You have a plumber come in and say, look, can you run pipes between these things, put a few pumps in place so that these can all be connected. And then you get your opportunities in place. And it's, in this case, again, over $100,000 in savings every year. So other water efficiency projects we've worked on, this is actually our office in Elmira. And we did a really cool project where we linked our water consumption to our HVAC. So what we did was we started pulling water off our roof, put it in that tank on the right, and then put a green wall in. And the green wall looks cool. It makes our front reception look nice. But another very functional thing that it does is we send all of our HVAC air, so all of our heating and cooling air, through that green wall. You can see kind of the vent on the top there that the light is shining off of. And so all the air in our office, which is now full of CO2 because everyone's working in there, gets forced through those plants. It becomes reoxygenated and recycled through the building. So we're not having to pull in a whole bunch of new cubic feet of air into our office, heat it, moisturize it, so on and so forth. We can simply recycle it, which is kind of a cool project. Another project that we're really pushing now, and we're actually installing this on our roof, is what's called a blue roof. So you may have heard of rainwater capture systems. We've often priced them out and recommended them in the past, but a lot of times they're not taken up is because you need to buy large tanks to store that rainwater. And even if you live in a rainy area, we have a really cool tool. We can look at your regional climate and it compares it to your water use. You know, in the best scenario, you might get 25% of your water for that year from your rainwater. And to invest a bunch of money in tanks and pumps and filters and all that, the payback tends to be 7 or 8 years. So a lot of people don't latch on to that. So what we found recently is a really cool system. It's called a blue roof, where you basically turn your roof into a holding tank. It can hold about 2 inches of water, and then you make smart valves or drains on your roof, so then you can pull that rainwater and use it in your buildings. Now, I know a lot of you are probably thinking, oh, what about the engineering load on that roof? What about, you know, mosquito larvae growing? There is a lot of issues, and they can all be accounted for. And at the end of this talk, I'll give you a link to a webinar we just did on blue roofs, which is kind of exciting. But then from an ecological perspective, you know, we're having 100-year storms more often than just every 100 years. So this retains that rainwater, so it's not going into sewer systems or storm drains that can't handle it. A lot of other benefits. One cool application of catching rainwater is using it for washing buses. Rainwater is a perfectly naturally RO'd water with not a lot of minerals or anything in it, so you don't have to use spot remover or anything like that. So we actually installed the bus wash here in Guelph, and we're using rainwater to do that job, which is a great fit for that job. You can also use it in cooling towers and that sort of thing where you need a higher quality water. The other great thing we do with our clients throughout Canada is if we're able to find water savings for them, a lot of major cities actually give you buyback for that water that you've saved, because it's cheaper for a city to pay you to save water than for them to build new capacity, so new pipes in the ground, new pumps, etc. So the main thing, or a major part of what we do with our clients is trying to find, you know, what sort of incentive or reward funding is out there to help push these projects forward. So this is one we did in York Region. And then, of course, the last part of our project is we've done all this pre-metering, and we find out where your water is being used and identify that issue. Then we implement it, and then, of course, we want to meter it afterwards to find out what we've saved. So right off the bat, we saw this pasteurization system. The water demand was unnecessarily high. So with a lot of things that we implemented on that project, we remetered it, and you can see there's quite a significant change. So I want you to leave today with something useful and practical, something that you can use at your facility tomorrow. So I want to unpack this idea of poor water use, and we always see it in the form of ball valves. So of course, we're going to find water saving opportunities related to the chemistry of your cooling tower or the timing cycles of your boiler and much more advanced things like that. But I would say 50% of our water opportunities are related to these very basic and unfortunate devices, the ball valve. They're left on, they're not turned on right, they're left on during weekends, and this is where you're going to have most of your savings. So this is actually an example from Friday. I was at a chicken plant on Friday, and it worked perfectly into this talk. So these are images right fresh off my camera. So I asked the maintenance or the production manager on the left there, where do you turn this ball valve when you're doing production during the day? This is to fill a scalder with hot water that the chickens are dragged through. So he turned it to the one on the left. And I said, well, what if I turned it a little bit less to the one on the right? Does that make a difference? He's like, well, I can't even tell a difference. So there's your difference. We've got about, a 1-2 degree turn there. So it's a very dumb system because one production manager is going to turn it one way, another way. And you might think that there's nothing to it. Well, that's just a minor turn in that ball valve. Well, we put our ultrasonic flow meter on it, and we saw that the one on the left is consuming 57 liters a minute, and the one on the right 49. So again, you may not think that's a big deal, but when you multiply that out over the year by their water bill rate, and actually had cheap cubic meters of water, it's $42,000 a year. That also takes into account the natural gas you've had to heat that water with. So 1 degree, $42,000. Or sorry, $4,200. So what are the solutions? Well, there's quite a few, and they're all cheap, which is great. Really, all we want to achieve is visibility of that water use. So we've got rotameters on the left. You can see when they're installed. So that little red float is going to move up and down and show you the exact liter per minute use in that line. Because there's going to be seasonalities at plants. In the spring, we need to use more water on this product for XYZ reason. In the fall, a different amount. So you want to be able to adjust it, but you want that visibility because now, as we've seen in this slide, we know that a very small adjustment is going to result in some very significant savings. So if you have that visibility, you can then achieve it. The middle one there is a digital version. We don't really recommend those because they don't really hold up well to sanitation hoses getting blasted at them. The rotometer, they're like $200, very cheap fix. And then on the right there is a timer switch. So we've also seen in facilities, they have these tanks they need to fill, and everyone has 1,000 jobs. So a guy will turn on a ball valve, and then he'll go do his 20 other jobs, and then he'll come back, and that tank's been overflowing for 30 minutes. Well, if you buy a $200 timing thing, you turn it once, you go do your other stuff, you know it's going to turn off. These are smart systems, and they can be installed for a very reasonable price and pay themselves back within months. So I've talked about water and the value of it and how you can achieve that value. And so now I want to compare it to electricity and natural gas opportunities that we've also found at food facilities. And again, just to reiterate, they always add up. They always provide a lot of value. But again, not as much as water, but still worthwhile to look at in detail. So I guess take a bigger step back. Everyone wants to be green, sustainable. As soon as you see solar panels on someone's roof, you think, oh man, they're really environmentally thinking, which in a lot of cases is true. But considering that, how many solar panels do you think that EnviroStewards has installed with our clients? Any guesses out there? More than 7? Okay. 0? None? There you go. There it is. Yeah, so we've actually put no solar panels with any of our companies. And again, it comes back to that return on investment. But more so, it comes down to how are you using your energy? So we've been to plants where they're using 30-year-old lighting systems. And they're saying, well, we want to put solar panels on our roof. And we're like, well, that's not the right way to do it. Like, why would you waste your energy more efficiently? Just put in new LED systems that in themselves have a less than a year payback. Then we'll start looking at how you're going to source the electricity to run that. So we've seen that quite a bit. And I always love sharing this example because it shows it most obviously. So this is a winery in Niagara, very progressive winery in all respects. So social responsibility, working conditions, and also ecologically. So they had a energy audit done, and that particular energy audit from another company was very quick off the shelf, wrote it up for them in about 30 minutes and said that you're going to have 5% savings with a 20-year payback. This involved buying a brand new chiller system. These are hundreds of thousands of dollars of equipment. So we said, well, let us go in there. Let us, use our process to find some savings for you. And we found that just in their HVAC system alone and the way it was timed was causing them to use an excessive amount of electricity. So we actually found them 40% savings with just a 4-month payback. And that in itself is great, but what's more important and is kind of hidden in this project is that this winery was ready to buy a whole bunch of new solar panels to make up for that electricity they're using and their planned expansion. And to buy them, they're very expensive. Then to install them, you then have to tear out your grapevines because you need to put them somewhere. And the grapevines is the sole purpose of being. That's their main area of revenue. So by tearing that out, you're actually losing revenue, which is causing a higher ROI. So, in this savings, it's really a 3 savings. They've reduced their electrical bill. They don't have to buy electrical panels, and they don't have to tear up their grape vineyards to realize that savings. So it was a really cool project to really demonstrate reduction is the most important part of the sustainability projects. So again, we do electrical metering. We've got about 50 or more amp loggers. We put them on all your electrical pumps and anything that uses electricity. And again, a minute-by-minute draw to understand exactly what machine is using how much electricity and when, because like water, you can't see it going through the lines. So this is a very common one that we see with plants, air compressors. If you look at air compressor as just a utility, it is by far your most expensive utility. You're actually losing 10% of the energy you put into it just to dehumidify the air, along with many other things. I was talking with Tom about a year or two ago, and he was telling me about a facility he was at, and they were using compressed air to aerate a tank of water. And I said, well, can you just use a blower? And he said, yeah, there's no reason why we can't. And that right there is about 10 times less your cost. So again, take the ball valve one with you and also take that with you. If there's anywhere on your facility that you're using compressed air where a blower could be used, replace it tomorrow because you're going to see earnings right away. So in this case, we can see that when the air compressor is off and not making any compressed air, it's still using 60% of its energy. And all that has to do with timing and programming the machine. And you can't see that unless you do this amp logging and see what's actually going on with that machine. Some other quick wins that you could, well, this one isn't as quick, but other wins you can have from the sustainability point of view, all on the idea of reduction. Most plants use boilers. I would say half plants we go to have economizers in their boilers. So 20% of the heat from the boiler is going out the stack. So you can actually capture that heat with an economizer and use that to heat up domestic water. You could heat up the makeup going into the boiler. So this is just one of many natural gas examples. But again, with this one, your payback's going to be a little bit further, maybe 3 to 4 years. So just to take that into consideration. So expanding on both the holistic side of doing a study and a brewery example, what we want to do is we want to look at your water demands, your natural gas demands, and your electrical demands for a whole system, because then you can start integrating them and doing matchmaking across the whole board. So here we are at a brewery. You've got your stack loss, which I mentioned. You've got all your water demands. You've got your energy inputs. And so there's your whole view of a typical brewery in a very simplified form. So, and there it is again, and this is just highlighting where cold and hot water is moving between the systems. And again, it's kind of like that example I showed at the beginning where you're buying 3 units of water and using them 3 separate ways when you can actually link those together. So here was the project we did at this tank or this facility where we're looking at hot water and just water sources and linking those to sinks. And you can do that in this case with 2 separate heat exchangers so that everything is still running as it should, but you're not excessively buying those utilities. And people say, oh, well, isn't that expensive to get those systems in place? And it can be. So, you know, a heat exchanger, they're all different. In this case, you know, this is a $250,000 heat exchanger. So those examples I showed of taking heat from one area and then using it in another area, it can be costly if you buy a 95% efficient heat exchanger, but you don't always have to go that route. The bottom right there is a copper wire wrap heat exchanger. It's about $300-400, maybe a little bit more, the price of copper now, versus 250,000. It's only going to be 85% efficient, not 95% efficient, but you're still getting way further from zero. So again, it's the whole idea of understanding the quantitative values and finding the right fit that's within your budget, but what also will give you efficiency no matter what. So I've kind of unpacked those kind of three utility streams: water, electricity, and natural gas, and the paybacks that they offer. And as I mentioned, we started off as a wastewater company, and we kept seeing product come down the drain. So water is the most valuable for paybacks. Natural gas and electricity are still good, but far and away we're realizing food, and in this case, just your product. So if it's dried flour or whatever you're creating, if you're seeing it on the ground and you call that your utility stream, it's about 5 times more valuable than your water. And the reason is you're embedding water into it. You're embedding your other utilities. You're embedding labor, and in this case, you may have grown it, but the facilities we go to, they're buying their raw material, they're making something out of it, and then they're throwing it on the floor. And it does happen. And the same way we do other projects, we do meter that very specifically, minute by minute, to understand what exactly is being lost. And I'm not sure if you've heard of the whole food loss and waste topic, but it's becoming more and more topical. We've actually had a few case studies that were featured on CBC News. And it's about 1/3 of the food that we create worldwide is thrown out. And I don't mean like chicken bones and feathers and that sort of thing. I mean truly edible food. We're growing it, we're picking it, we're harvesting it, we're packaging it, and then we're throwing it out for various reasons, which I'll unpack a little bit. And so what we typically hear from companies, if we look at this hierarchy on the right, oh, well, we don't have that issue here because we compost our waste. Okay, but your waste is edible food. So even if you're composting it, which is far better than landfill, which creates methane gas and so on and so forth, you're still, just because you're diverting it doesn't mean you're still wasting it and not realizing that it could be edible food. So to give you a very specific example of this, because you're probably thinking, well, why would a company throw out edible food? That just doesn't make any sense. It's often done in the form of efficiency during production. You only have so much time, you got to push it through. There's just naturally going to be waste. Sometimes it's complacency, and sometimes it's just not seen. So in this case, this was at Campbell's. That machine there is an optical sorter. So they're putting all their chopped carrots through that. And a air gun is kicking out all the off-spec carrots that have been chopped. So ones that have rot in them or skin on them and so on and so forth. So it's a very advanced machine. It should be only kicking out unedible food. It shouldn't be going into their soup. Well, what we found, so when we first got there, that red tote was not there. All the rejected carrots was coming along that conveyor belt and going into a floor drain and being pumped out to their wastewater plant. And everyone thought, well, it's a beautiful big machine. It's hundreds of thousands of dollars. We trust it. It's doing its job. So we said, okay, first thing, let's put a red tote there and see what it's actually rejecting. So we did that. We filled 4 to 6 of those totes every day that were all being thrown out to compost. Then we took, smaller containers of that wasted food here. And during off production, we kept the optical sorter going and we reintroduced it. And we slowed down the rate of reintroduction a marginal amount. And we found that 50% of the carrots that went through at a much more gradual rate were actually allowed to go through to production because they were still good carrots. What we realized is, there's many problems here. One was due to efficiency, this machine was being overloaded and it couldn't handle the rate that it was all going through. So there was a lot of casualties that were being kicked out. So that was number one. And, maybe there's not a solution for that. Maybe you only have so much staff. There's only so much production time in the day. So we have to keep it going at that rate. Okay, you might be able to justify that. But what we also found is that the lighting system was off. There was a couple bulbs that were broken. So it truly couldn't see. And that's the main thing it needs to be able to do. the software hadn't been upgraded in 10 years. And incidentally, the operating screen, the HDMI, was it had been blasted with a sanitation hose, so it wasn't operating at full functionality. So, you know, it was about $10,000 to $20,000 in fixes that were illuminated during this project. You know, we found 6 other opportunities here. This one was about $250,000 in lost good carrots every year. So about $10,000 to $15,000 of investment from that optical sorter company. They came back, updated the software, so on and so forth. You know, that's like a month in return on value. And it's just taking the time to understand where these losses are occurring, putting a quantitative value to it, and implementing solutions. So again, how does food loss happen in a plant? This is what I typically see when I go through a facility. And these aren't meant to be, I hate the word audit. These aren't meant to be consulting, audit, got you moments. And I should also say that, you know, I've mentioned Campbell's and a few other companies. There's waste everywhere. The companies that recognize that and have the wherewithal to bring that in, to bring in our services and to recognize this problem and to find solutions, you know, I got to hand it to them, because they're really the progressive companies that are finding the solutions and recognizing these losses and wanting to implement fixes. So these are, I would say, constant stream of losses. They all have the same root cause of malfunctioning conveyors. And everyone at the plant has their job. They're trying to get the product out the door. Sometimes they just don't have the time to understand this, or there's, you know, a communication link that needs to happen between the people who are on that machine all day and management who are making the decisions. So, you know, a lot of times we're brought in just to be that liaison between those two groups, but also to put these problems into a quantitative, consumable way so that some real action can happen. Again, the other thing with food loss is it happens at the strangest times. That's actually me sitting next to a pipe at a dairy. It was like a cable guy. He said, yeah, the loss will go through that pipe somewhere between 3 and 5 a.m. So I sat there waiting for it to come through to grab a sample of it, to understand the oil and grease that was in it, and the milk percent content. You know, missing guards on conveyors, again, not meant to be a gotcha moment. It's just meant to be, you know, let us be a set of third eyes, move through your facility and see where the losses are, and let's do some quick fixes to make that happen. The other major thing is rates. So how often is this occurring? So this is at a bagel factory. Those are trays that hold the bagels. They put cornmeal down so that you don't have it sticking. We noticed that the cornmeal is falling to the ground all day. So every hour on the hour, I'd sweep it up and weigh it. And over the year, we got 29,000 kgs of cornmeal being lost. And then we also want to do a sanity check. You know, is our quantification correct? Food loss is a little different from your utilities. You can't put on an automatic measuring device, which we're actually developing in-house now with some cameras and some learning software, which has been a really cool project. But for this one, you know, I went to their accounting department. I said, hey, what's your line item for cornmeal? How much are you paying for that? Or how much are you buying in a year? And it was about 62,000 kgs. So that's our sanity check. We want to make sure that we're in the right ballpark. And so about half of the cornmeal that they were buying was being lost to floor. What's the solution? Well, there's quite a few. You know, you could do a sanitary stainless steel catch underneath that machine. Catch it, reprocess it, reuse it. What could reprocessing be? Well, you know, at $1 a kg, it's $30,000 a year you're losing. So that's basically your budget. If $30,000, what can you do? Well, you could send it through a toaster. You could send it under a UV light. A lot of different solutions you could think of, or you could tighten up the way that the cornmeal is being applied to the trays so it's not being lost in the first place. A lot of different ways to go about it, and you're not really going to go after that savings unless you've quantified. Here's another really interesting one we see at bakeries quite a bit. So, you know, we'd see these trays come through and an operator was there all day with a big scraper, scrape off the buns, reintroduce the tray, do that all day. Same tray would come back, same buns attached to the same spot. So what had happened, the root cause is the glazing's gone on the tray. Get that tray out of production, put it in a freshly glazed one, you're not gonna have those losses. This is a really cool food loss opportunity because it's kind of a mix of two worlds. We've got our AMP logging and then our food loss. So again, getting back to that root cause, why is the food being lost? So in this case, it was an off-spec bagel. They call them baseball bagels. And personally, I prefer these bagels because the cream cheese doesn't fall through the middle. But as per their brand, you know, you can't sell a bagel without a hole in the middle. So what was happening? Well, we put an amp logger on their mixer, and we noticed that there was these long downtimes, which meant that the bagels sitting on the line for a longer period of times proofed longer, and that hole would close in. They'd still get baked, and then they'd get thrown out because they were off spec. So kind of a neat collision of worlds there. We did a big project with Bo's Brewery, and with the neat thing that came out of this project, this was with the Center for Environmental Cooperation, which is a major part of NAFTA. Really cool case study that came out of this. So it's all, Tom talked quite a bit about, your footprint of GHGs within cannabis. It's the same as every product, but what we realized with this project, everything I've talked about has happened within the manufacturing facility. But once we started to break down the GHGs embedded in your yeast, in your hops, in your barley, we noticed that 99% of the GHG in your either end product or your raw ingredients was before it even came to your door. And the reason we highlight that is that every time you lose something on your production line, you're losing all that embedded GHG, which is almost 99% of what you're using. They have a -6% on waste there because they're able to repurpose their grain and use it in some pretty cool ecological ways. So again, on this whole food loss and waste, we actually got a really cool funding from the Walmart Foundation. They're quite aware of this issue and they want to be part of the solution. So they helped finance 50 studies to find 3 unique areas of loss at any 50 plants across the country, whoever wanted to sign up. So we had, major dairies signing up, we had breweries, we had bakeries, we even went out to some fish plants in Nova Scotia, and we found 3 unique spots where loss was falling to the floor or down their drain or wherever. And we quantified all those, and we found that when we put it on a caloric basis, it was about 15 million meals that were being lost a year. You can see all your other energy that was embedded into those losses. And actually, they've doubled down on this project and provided more funding. And of course, Walmart Foundation kicks in money, and then the facility kicks in money to study these problems and find solutions. So we actually got signed on to do another one here in 2021, and we're revisiting those facilities. And it's been really fun. We've been calling the facilities back and saying, have you implemented these and why? Most of these facilities are saying, yes, of course we implemented them. The savings was obvious. We didn't realize it existed, and so the quantification made it a case, and they've been pushed forward. So that's been a really cool project. So this, I've mentioned the Commission for Environmental Cooperation. So we just recorded a whole webinar, kind of like this, but on food loss, which I'd encourage you to look at in more detail. It's on the web. Another one we did recently was this blue roofs. So if that's an opportunity at your facility, you could supplement some of the water you're using in your facility by collecting it on your roof. And I can talk to you more about that. And I've talked quite a bit, but there's a whole bunch more to unpack on the whole idea of reducing to be ecological. We're also a B Corp company, which we're quite proud of. I'm not sure, I don't think I've seen any cannabis B Corps, but I don't know the industry well enough to say if there is or there isn't, but I'd love to talk to you more about that. If you're interested in sort of some international development work, we always like to talk about that. And then I didn't really get into wastewater, but that's a huge area of what we do. And if that's an area that's a pain point for your team, we'd love to talk about that as well. So thanks so much for listening. I hope you can take some of these learnings away and just, the idea of how to approach sustainability. I think the key message I like to share is that it doesn't have to be a costly undertaking to get this back. So thanks again. And Tom and Dave and StratCan, I really appreciate you having me on today.
Yeah, thanks for your talk, Dave. It's very interesting. So how do you guys want to do the QA? There's a few questions in the Q&A and in the chat as well.
So I'm on mute. There's a few there regarding solar panels. Thermal solar panels have a huge potential saving energy globally. Yeah, absolutely. And actually, the whole global perspective is really interesting. A lot of times when we talk about solar panels with our potential clients, we kind of encourage them to, if that's something you want to invest in, would you consider investing them into an area that has a higher sun ratio throughout the day. So that means, would you invest in areas where they need electricity and the solar panels would work more effectively than they would in Canada? So that's one way about it. And yeah, like solar panels are fantastic. They work. I think the point I wanted to make is that reducing is far more valuable to most companies. B Corp doesn't have a program for recreational cannabis yet. Oh, okay. Well, that's probably why. So I can't speak to that, but there's the reason. Oh yeah, Dave, you had a bit of an echo.
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't know. Can you guys hear my mic? I hope you can. So now there's an opportunity to really, interact for 5, 10, 15 minutes. So you can either in the chat box or in the Q&A box, you can do that. Or if you want to get on the mic, you can raise your hand and we can unmute you. And then we can have a quick interactive discussion. So obviously, again, a lot of information to consider. And if you don't have any questions now, we're always happy to answer them over email or social media. But yeah, now's your opportunity to frame what David has talked about and what he's seen in the non-cannabis industries, and maybe relate that to cannabis. So open it up to the floor.
Tom, are you able to see the two questions, one from Valerie and one from Anonymous in the Q&A?
Yeah. So the first question here from Valerie, how does greenhouse production compare to indoor grow in terms of energy intensity? Depends on what kind of greenhouse you're talking about. If you're talking about, a greenhouse without any artificial lighting, well, again, now you're just using the light and you're capturing, the environment and controlling that better. So a lot less energy has to go in because you're not using those lights or battling it. Most greenhouses in Canada are hybrid or supplemental. And so again, that one study by the Posterity Group found they're about 30% more efficient, so 30 to 50%. So they're better, but there's also unfortunately less production and more loss related to cannabis that's grown in a greenhouse, generally where the climate is not so precisely controlled. So things like botrytis or other diseases can really ruin a crop. And at that point, you can either extract it or throw it out, and it won't come to completion. There is another question here from an anonymous attendee. Are there any references or data to support the use of solar in conjunction with indoor cultivation, taking into consideration that geography of facility is important? So I don't know if we mentioned this, but a couple of years ago, there was a licensed facility that made the news that it was an indoor facility, but they had the whole roof covered in solar panels, right? So they were taking solar energy at about 20 or 25, 30% energy efficiency, converting that into electrical efficiency, and then using their lights. And the joke was, well, why don't you just get rid of the panels and the roof and use a greenhouse, and you have a lot more going on. So I think anytime that you can supplement more dirty energy by more renewable energy, it is great. But we are in Canada, placed in BC, don't get as much sun, so it is geographically dependent. And also, I think the point is, really lower your energy use. You might not need to use solar panels if you use things like LEDs and you have proper energy control. So that's what I would be looking at if I was building a facility, is how do I make that facilities more efficient, not how do I supplement my energy use. Would you agree there, Dave?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it's a interesting example. I'll leave it at that.
Yeah.
not the best use of solar panels per se, when a window will work.
We did have another question sent over email. I think it might have been Valerie. The question was about using peat as a growing medium. And David has an anecdote as well, and I do. So, David and I studied peatlands in our former lives. Peatlands are just long-term carbon banks, created in wetlands or other saturated areas. They represent thousands of years of slow carbon accumulation. And it's really unfortunate that it's such a great growing medium. It's high porosity and all that. But the reality is you take 5,000, 10,000 years of sequestered carbon, you drain the land, you vacuum up the peat, you process it, and then a cannabis company or any greenhouse company, any grower uses that for 3 or 4 months and then lets it oxidize. So it's one of the worst from an environmental perspective impacts, and there's a significant cost there. So I would prefer coco coir, which is from coconut husks, more of a renewable resource, and leave the peat in the ground. Dave, you have an anecdote there about some costs associated with that as well. So
Yeah, we just started working with a sprouts grower here, and they had that was a big pain point for them, was, you know, it was only about a 2-month shelf life that they would use these peat pads. So in addition to having to rebuy them and that, it was almost $250,000 a year they were paying just to get them hauled off site. That's how many they were using. And so what we did was team them up with a local landscape company that would blend it into their soil. And just the shipping costs alone and the dewatering save about $90,000 a year. So it's one way to approach it. Obviously, that's not getting back to the root cause. And we brought up coconut husk and everything else with them. And the unfortunate part is it's the best in a lot of ways, especially for these sprout growers. So yeah, there's a lot of work in that area trying to find ways to find something a little more efficient. But just if you can find other ways to reduce the costs, that's kind of the point.
yeah, Adam Greenblatt here has a question: does using ProMix reduce overall carbon sink? So, you know, ProMix is, I would consider, probably an industry standard for cannabis as far as an inert grow media. ProMix is just peat that has perlite. Perlite is just basically a very light rock that we create to kind of add porosity and change the drainage. It's also inert. So, and then it has mycorrhizae and other kind of biologicals in there that help production. So, but fundamentally, I don't know, by weight, it's mostly still peat. So it does not do anything to solve that issue. It's a great growing media. So, you know, if you're growing cannabis, the goal is to maximize your output. That's one way to do it. So, you know, that's a great positive, but the negative is you're still using sequestered carbon obtained from wetlands across Canada. So, not ideal. Lucas Wukash here has restorative farming. Would that offset carbon dioxide release? So I'm not exactly sure what you mean by restorative farming, but again, when we're talking about indoor cultivation, we're talking about, you know, scientifically or highly technical cultivation. There's nothing restorative about it. If we're talking about outdoor cultivation, there are their own issues with farming, just like any other farming. We have runoff, pesticide use, you know, nutrient loading and depletion. But at the end of the day, you know, I would prefer to see plants grown outdoors in areas geographically that can sustain cannabis production year round. And unfortunately, that's not Canada. But we're a long ways away from moving into a global community where we can grow in South America and then import that cannabis a year round. There's a question here: based on your anecdotes on solar power and coco coir, would you say that you would not recommend solutions just because you have never seen them work before? Grows horrible electric generators. I mean, coco coir is a fantastic medium. Other people swear by it. So no issues with that. That's used, and just solar power in general. Again, solar power is great, but it's inefficient, it's costly, the ROI is expensive. You need battery storage. You know, when the sun sets, you need to store that power and use it. So it's not reliable, and it's I would just, you know, as Dave said, that's probably the last place I'd look when setting up a facility. I would just look at LEDs over HPS systems is a perfect example of that.
Yeah, it's frustrating. I almost think it should be mandated. Like, we go into so many plants that haven't switched to LEDs, and it's crazy. Like, the paybacks there, the lighting quality is so much better, and the efficiency, it's like in some cases 90% more efficient. You know, to make that up with solar panels or any other sort of energy source, reduction is the key. So and it costs money to reduce. You're going to have to invest in LEDs, and it can be a costly undertaking if you're getting a contractor in to switch out all your ballasts and everything. So money has to be spent somewhere. So I think the takeaway, or the hill I'm going to die on is reduce first. Don't start investing in really nice looking solar panels when there's always low hanging fruit. We'll go through plants in 2018. We'll return in 2020. Some opportunities that are very basic either haven't
We lost Dave. Big solar panel got him.
I think it looks like maybe his screen froze for a moment. So would you like to continue on that?
Yeah, we'll get the next question going, and we'll see if we can get David back here. Why do you think growing outdoors in Canada is not cost efficient when outdoor grow in Canada is 2 times in regions it grows best? I never said it's not cost efficient. The issue with growing outdoors in Canada is the vast majority of our climate can only support one crop per year. You could do 2. I've heard it done, depending on the genetics and your microclimate and kind of what your goals are. But at the end of the day, think of the cannabis supply chain and the herbal of cannabis and how well it holds for months at a time. So let's just use an example. 1 crop per year, you harvest in October. The consumers are probably not going to be too keen of using flower that's 8-9 months old, 10 months old, because you can only have that 1 crop and it's storing, right? So there is that issue there. But growing outdoors in Canada is possible. People are doing it in Lillooet, in the Okanagan, in southeastern Ontario, I believe. So it's totally possible. The fundamental issue is that it's not great, and there's a lot of risk there. And most of the investment thus far in Canada has gone into these large or small to large scale indoor facilities because they offer precision and control, generally higher quality cannabis, and security as well. So yeah, I mean, I would like to see grown outdoors. I just don't think Canada is the right place to grow tropical like plants. There's a question for Dave about developing water systems from hot springs. I mean, I'll let Dave answer that if he comes back online. Not sure what happened to his computer, but generally that's just using geothermal, right? It's just energy embedded in the water itself. Zena has a question in line with the subject of reducing a company's power consumption. If a design incorporated both LED lighting, solar panels, and possibly geothermal, what are your thoughts? Yeah, I would say, everything that you can do to lower your impact is a good thing. But LEDs are expensive, solar panels are expensive, and geothermal is not available everywhere. So if you can, and money is unlimited, absolutely. But the reality is it costs a lot of money just to get a cannabis facility built generally, to Health Canada standards, and generating revenue and profit is a whole nother problem. So I would say that by the time you finish building out that facility, you'd probably be broke, because the ROI on that is just too long, unfortunately.
Do you see the one in the QA there, Tom?
Yeah. So, Dave Fox is back. We'll let him answer the environment stewards one next. So there's a question from Misha here. Geothermal seems to be able to provide a base temperature for housing in the GTA. There are test projects in Saskatchewan to generate energy and help the industry out as we get into hopefully less oil-dependent society. What sort of industrial take-up do you see for at least the heating, cooling needs, cannabis, and in general? Well, generally speaking, we've had billions of dollars of capital deployed in Canada already, for these high-end facilities. What I would say is, I'm sure down the road, as these companies continue to battle for pennies on the dollar, for market share, for profit and revenue, at some point they're going to look at their facility and probably hire someone like Dave or Dave's company to come in and say, okay, guys, we need to reduce our cost by 10 or 20%. We've already looked at the labor. We've already automated stuff. What's the last thing we can do? And at that point, things like geothermal and other creative ways to approach this problem is going to come to light. But I think the problem is a lot of companies have blinders on. They just got a license. They just built a facility. They're just trying to get to the market. And we're not going to see, and there's still capital readily flowing into this industry, less so every day, but still. So at some point, the market, the invisible hand on the market should force these companies to be more efficient, because it's either that or, death. Dave Fox, are you back?
Yeah, I'm here. The video is not showing. It says the host needs to turn it on again, but I can hear everything. My internet blipped out there. Not sure.
Okay,
There's a question, or
yeah, there's a question for you. We'll get your video on, but it says, does Enviro Stewards have any experience working with developing water systems to a facility from hot springs?
oh, no, it's never really been in our wheelhouse. It'd be interesting to find out what the exact project is. Whether it's is it hot springs, like hot water, hot geothermal water, I guess, or
Yeah, it would be to me it'd be like geothermal, basically just really hot water, right? So you could
okay.
heat it and you can run.
Yeah, it'd be interesting. Maybe running through a heat exchanger or something along that line. But yeah, I'd be more interested to unpack that project, even though we haven't touched on it.
I think Malka has a comment there.
Yeah, the ROI is not possible to growing cannabis at a scale in big facilities. Leaning towards microclimates and producing to your own region's energy mix is a better thing, would you say? Yeah, I mean, when we look at, again, if you look at that nature study, it was quite clear that different parts of the country are better to grow cannabis than others from a climate or microclimate perspective and an energy mix perspective. So if you were able to optimize where you want to grow, you would, consider things like land costs, energy mix, labor costs, and hopefully find a nice balance there where you choose a region that you can grow indoors. And that nature paper is a great example. Growing indoor cannabis in Hawaii is one of the most environmentally damaging places you can grow. It leads to the question, why the heck would you grow cannabis indoors in Hawaii, right? Where most of the energy comes from oil or gas, where you could grow it in California if you're growing indoors, because maybe the regulations require that. But the hope is in the future that these laws relax around the world, and then there's going to be less, issue or lower issue with security and quality control. Maybe we'll find ways to produce cannabis at scale outdoors without fear of those things. And at some point, the hope is indoor cannabis growing will be a thing of the past, I would say, which sucks, right? Because it's a huge part of our industry here for the next foreseeable future. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry, but looking from an environmental lens, it's not ethical. It's not the path forward. Do you think about mirrors collecting sunlight to reduce electrical energy during daytime? Yeah, and all these renewable energy sources I think are great. It just comes down to how quickly can you implement this and how mature the technology is. And I would say, again, look at the low-hanging fruit, which is part of Dave's whole presentation is, yeah, you can buy something that's $250,000 or just buy something that's nearly as good and better for a lot less and implemented a lot quicker. So Dave, I think you'd agree with that. It's just a lot of different approaches, but choose the simple one. Tara, who's definitely not my wife and definitely not a canned question here, says, you spoke a lot about water losses. Can you speak briefly on some of the more obvious typical water losses? So yeah, I mean, in a indoor cannabis facility, just think of what you're doing when you're irrigating. You have a room filled with plants. That room, those plants need water to live. So you water them once every day, once every few days, depending on your system and how big these plants are. What do most companies do that I've seen? They take that water, the plants transpire it, right? They release it into the air and they're creating humidity. You can't have high humidity or else you'll get, issues with disease and mold and another growth. So you have to dehumidify it with an air conditioner or a dehumidifier. And then what most people do is they take that condensate, that captured water, and it goes down into municipal runoff, into whatever, right? I mean, it's just out. What you should do is close that cycle. You have a closed environment. Take that water that's essentially purified already, purify it a little bit more, recapture 70-80% of it, and use that to water your plants again. Use that for gray water. Use that for general sanitation, whatever. These are all simple things. These are simple plumbing issues, right? Just what you need is a tank and maybe UV light and filter, and now you have an somewhat infinite water cycle in your system. But again, my experience in this industry is it's been a race to the starting line, and oftentimes these little nuances in engineering and design are not taken into consideration. And then once you're going, then you have blinders on. You don't have time to think about that. You have to worry about paying your employees and crop loss and dealing with regulators and stuff. So there are simple solutions, and I think the low hanging fruit is the best to go at. If you can decrease your water use by 50%, save $10,000-$20,000, that allows you to invest into other parts of the business, or maybe a new employee. So that's the way I would look at it, for water savings in production in cannabis.
Mm-hmm.
Dave, you want to take some of these? Can the runoff from RO filtration, air conditioning at a large cost savings?
The runoff from RO filtration, air conditioning. Yeah. So on the topic of, so when I hear runoff from RO filtration, actually we've interacted with RO the most at hockey rinks, because they have to run all their water through RO, so the ice is at a certain standard. I think, I don't know what the ratio is, but it's basically you make a liter of water with an RO and you lose 1 or 2 liters because it's being pushed through that membrane.
Yeah.
But the reason that water is being rejected is because it now carries the stuff you don't want in your water. So we've played around with some ideas of how we can use that water, unless it's moving stuff through a flume or, being used as a very base kind of gray water use. You can't really implement it in too many ways. As for AC, yeah, potentially. You can even pull heat off your refrigeration compressors as well, because they produce a lot of heat. But yeah, any water, and that's kind of half the project. It's one thing to find that water, but then it's another thing to, do we have to recondition it? Where's the best place it can go? And that's what has to be really unpacked in a little more detail, because especially food and beverage plants, and I'm sure it's the same as cannabis. You have to be very conscious of the quality of that water. You can't reintroduce it in the product, obviously, and other sort of things like that. I can tackle the one question: do you look at carbon sink, carbon capture in your assessments? Absolutely. So we identify all your GHG equivalents on all of our projects. We've actually just started doing simply GHG or carbon neutrality or carbon negativity projects. We just did it with Molson, and we're engaging with 2 more breweries now. So it's 2 parts. It's, what's your overall goal? And then how do we get there? Assessing your scope 1, scope 2, GHG emissions. So I hope that answered the question. Do you look at carbon sink, carbon capture? So I guess the way we do it is it's carbon assessment and what you're actually producing now, and then carbon reduction. So you're not producing as much. As far as sinks and captures, our company we don't really work in the technological space of pulling it out of the air and capturing it, or those sorts of things.
There's a question from Alfredo. In a typical Canadian household, how many plants should be allowed for an indoor production on the medical cannabis program? What would be ideal volume considering the number of households in Canada producing for medical cannabis in reference of environmental urban impact? This is a fantastic question. What we didn't even cover. I covered the legal commercial production, right? Industry. There's the illicit portion, which is probably just as big, and there's no way to really regulate that. And then there's the medical program, which allows people to grow cannabis indoors or outdoors, however they want. So there's, I think, 40 to 50,000 licenses, medical licenses across Canada. From the current cannabis regulation program, there's still the remaining 20 or 30,000 from the old system that still has an injunction, I believe, on it. And there's people just growing cannabis because you can grow cannabis for plants at home pretty much anywhere. So even if we use a very conservative number of maybe 10,000 or 20,000 people that have 1,000-watt light in their home, one light, that's 20,000 of those inefficient lights that are just on 12 to 24 hours a day, a few months of the year round. that aren't unaccounted for. Again, if you can grow cannabis outdoors where plants should be grown, right now is the perfect time to start getting your garden ready in most of Canada, unless you're in Edmonton, apparently. Um, you know, don't. It's nice growing plants indoors. So from a scientific or technical perspective, it is amazing to grow. The precision you get, the quality you can get. You know, you don't have to use pesticides or other pest controls as much, because you can have a nice, clean, controlled area. But don't grow your cannabis indoors, especially in the summer, unless you physically can't. And generally it's quite inefficient, right? So, you know, just keep all that in mind. I would never tell a patient who requires medical cannabis how much cannabis they should or shouldn't grow. What I would just say is take what we've discussed, scale that down to your room, and see that there are issues there, and look at, you know, multiply that by tens of thousands of people in Canada that are doing this, and then, you know, how can you help the environment yourself? um there's a question here, Dave, I'll let you use the heat pump one. There's a
Sure.
question from Barbara though. Tom, your plants need minerals. In a closed water cycle you have to add them? Absolutely, for sure. But just also keep it, and that's just part of the fertigation. So you would use your clean condensate, and you would reconstitute with the nutrients, hydroponic or otherwise. Sometimes the soil has the nutrients embedded. You don't need to worry about that. But just keep in mind that the other advantage of recaptured condensate is, if you're using city water, some people actually do RO or filtration because they don't want the chlorine or anything. They want to get that down to as low as possible so that it's consistent when they add their nutrients back in. So there's an even advantage there using condensate. Once you have your initial water and you circulate that within your facility, you don't have to recondition that water itself, which, as Dave said, is about, you know, a 1-to-1 ratio. For every liter of RO you produce, you waste a liter or two of water that goes down the drain. So again, these little changes kind of add up, and they impact other parts of the process. Lucas Wukash here had a question about heat pumps. I don't know if you see that, Dave.
Yeah, there's the two there I can answer. Have you reused water from your product in facility toilets? It's a very common practice to use recaptured gray water, rainwater, even RO water. You could use that in your toilets throughout your whole facility. It's crazy how Canada has some of the best water in the world. We're flushing it down our toilets. So yeah, definitely, it's one of your safest avenues to use a sink, a source of water, and put it in that sink. In this case, a toilet. So yes, it's done. Heat pumps, absolutely. I'm pretty excited about geothermal, and there's geothermals on many different scales. The one you mentioned is, your ground source heat pump. There's whole communities in Ontario here that do that. Toronto, a major part of the downtown core, does that into Lake Ontario. It's a very real and practical base load of heating and cooling that I think we should dig into a little bit more. I've looked at it at a residential level. It's pretty expensive, 50,000 plus to put in a heat pump system, which can be expensive, but maybe makes sense on a facility level. But what I'm seeing more and more in my neighborhood is air source pumps. So they're actually pulling that differential from outside, just in the ambient air outside, which is a much more cost-effective way to do it. And that's kind of one scale of geothermal. The other is like your deep geothermal, so where you're drilling down into the ground and pulling out deep source heat. I actually worked in the oil industry for a while, and we'd send rubber tools down these old oil wells, and they come back melted. And I'm thinking, what are we doing pumping oil out and burning it? Like, there's already heat down there. Why don't we just, harvest it? And it's exciting to see that that's actually happening. There's a really cool test plot that's having some really good results in Saskatchewan. But even just using that differential, so, even if you don't have really high quality heat that can run a turbine and create electricity, there's still going to be areas, much broader areas. You could build an industrial park over top of an area that has shallow ground source heat of, even if it's 80 degrees Fahrenheit. We can pull that water up, send it through a heat exchanger, and run most of your building systems off that temperature. We don't always have to go for the most valuable, highest heat like they have in Iceland or those sorts of areas. So yeah, absolutely, it's a way to get energy in a lot of different ways. Do you look at measuring carbon sink and carbon capture inside a facility? I can't answer that one, Tom.
Oh, carbon is captured in growing plants, right? So, yeah, so basically plants are generally 50% carbon, right? So, you do, when you're growing cannabis, you do carbon capture, right? Um, you start with nothing, and then the plants absorb CO2 that generally is injected into facilities, which we didn't even mention, but I did on a slide, but not verbally. Just consider that our natural average ambient CO2 concentration in the air is about 350, I guess 400 ppm now, rising ever so quickly over the last few decades. When you walk into a general grow room, you generally see 12 to 1500 ppm CO2 levels because cannabis is such a fast growing plant. If you can satisfy its water, light, and nutrient demands, essentially the limiting factor is the carbon in the air. Plants don't take carbon from the roots, which is often a misconception if you are not aware of how plants synthesize their nutrients. But they take nutrients like nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium and water from the roots, sometimes from the leaves, but ultimately the CO2 is absorbed from the air, and that's what produces the biomass, right? So when you start with a little clone and then 2 months later you have a plant that with dry weight weighs a kilo or more, you've captured that, but you've put in 5 tons of CO2 or carbon to get a kilo of cannabis, which half of that is carbon. Not a good ratio at all, right? So it's definitely not like we're growing cannabis indoors and then contributing to cleaning up our environment. We're still polluting everything. I would say it's negligible. Now, hemp or cannabis grown outdoors is great, but then what do people do? Well, they combust it, and then it oxidizes, right? If it's in a landfill or compost. So it's a short-term sink. It's not a long-term sink like peat or wetlands, which just maintain reducing reductive kind of chemical conditions to just keep building up. So by no means are we capturing cannabis or CO2 using cannabis or hemp, unless you were to sequester that maybe in biochar form. That's a great way to take carbon and kind of make it less reactive, but it's not at all a path forward.
I can answer the one, Barbara. I assume she's writing from Germany.
Mhm.
Yeah, it'd be an interesting comparison. There's actually a great Netflix series called Explained, and they do one on water, which unpacks all those stats. And by no surprise, Canada is one of the heaviest water users per capita. And I think that's also because we have the world's largest source of fresh water in the form of ice sheets, and then, of course, in the form of the Great Lakes and the millions of other small freshwater lakes. So I kind of touched on that at the beginning. It's our personal perception of what water is and the value of it. We are surrounded by it. It's absolutely everywhere. So to turn on a tap and think nothing of it is just our culture, for better or worse. I would argue for worse. We could be a lot more efficient. And yeah, it'd be a really interesting comparison between, your Western European countries. I would say for worse, sub-Saharan countries like we work in, South Sudan, Uganda, their water use is going to be even less than 90 liters a minute a day, or like 90 liters per person per day. There's a whole wide range. I think it's becoming more and more globally aware that there are some serious water strict locations where you just don't have that access. And yeah, I think it's just the stewards and all of us. Like, we just need to be more respectful of the beautiful virgin water we have in this country, and just respecting it a little bit more, and turning back those ball valves a bit. So yeah, it'd be cool to do. I just looked it up. I found first Google search was 335 liters per day for Canadians. So we're almost
number one. And I just want to make it clear, as someone who studied groundwater and hydrology as well, when we deplete groundwater, that's generally not considered in most places a renewable resource, because it takes hundreds or thousands of years for that water to recharge in the groundwater. So once it's out, it's out. And you look at Mexico, where they have land compaction, because you move the water and then it just drops down, and it has physical impacts on structures. probably not an issue in Canada, but also think of the energy and the resources used to condition that water to make it safe to drink. And then also that water has to go down and be cleaned up again, right? So, again, you're putting that on the wastewater plants to filter it out, to oxygenate it, to remove it, to rechlorinate it. So, just because you're using water, even if you're using, rainwater, that's great. That's probably the best option. But then, where does that go? Down municipal system? Well, they have to condition it. When you look at farming as well, you're depending on what kind of farming you're doing, organic or salt-based fertigation, that has runoff, right? That can go into waterways, that can go into sensitive environments nearby, which can affect local flora and fauna, cause eutrophication, and just generally have a bad impact. So anytime, the whole reuse, reduce, recycle, or reduce, reuse, recycle, it's always reduction is our first goal, should be our first goal. Limit our use, optimize our use. The reality is we're not going to shut down cannabis farming or any kind of manufacturing tomorrow in Canada. We've just started down this path, and the rest of the world has to kind of follow us. So, we just need to reduce that and find creative ways to manage that. But, long term, I really don't see how, given all the challenges we face as a society with climate change, that Canada will be producing large scale quantities of cannabis in 30, 20 years when we have plenty of other countries that are better suited to grow cannabis outdoors in hopefully a more sustainable way. I think we're pretty much getting to the end of some questions here. Like, I don't think that growing cannabis outdoors is going to have a significant impact on gas emissions generally. Not, again, it has an impact. It does sequester carbon, but short term. So last chance, audience. Thank you for hanging in for 2.5 hours. It's been great. So last chance for us to chat. If not, Dave Fox is always happy to answer your questions. Just I'll include his personal cell phone number after the chat. And everyone can call him up. But yeah, no, thank you, everyone. It is important. I think it just, what we take away from this is it's a new industry. We are leaders in Canada. We should lead environmentally. The ironic part of this, all this for me, is most people I meet that work in cannabis or come from cannabis culture are very tuned in to environmental issues and social issues. And, they might be vegans or vegetarians and try their best to limit their impact on this environment. And then they smoke 3 grams of cannabis a day. And that contributes way more to emissions in Canada than anything else they do. So now is the time to start thinking to bring this into a collective kind of conversation and ensure that the next generation of cannabis entrepreneurs in Canada, I think, go down the proper path of sustainability. So thanks Dave Fox, thanks Dave Brown, and those at StratCan, and I'll leave it to Dave Brown here to close it up.
Thank you.
Well, thanks, Tom and Dave. That was a great presentation you gave, and I really appreciate everyone else tuning in. And we will be posting this hopefully, I think, later this week. Is that correct, Tom? We should have be able to upload this to YouTube or something like that.
Yeah, I think so.
Oh, and I think we've got to all the questions, most of the questions in the chat, it looks like.
I think so. The good ones, anyways. Thanks, everyone. Be safe out there.
Thank you.
Take care.
All right, take care, everybody.
Yeah.
Bye.